Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is April 30, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant in his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure today to be here with Cynthia Olson. Cynthia, thank you so much. Where are you calling in from?
Thanks, Jerry. I'm calling from Dublin, Ireland.
Oh, how cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Best thing for a human being. I would say empathy.
That is a great word. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
I would say conversation, so ideally sort of what we're doing now, one-on-one, maybe in a pub.
Nice. And why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, I mean, I suppose in a way, like the collection of information could be a way of sort of imposing like a design and order on something, on a system or a community or a society. I'm sure like there was sort of an evolutionary like thought process to it, but I like my initial thought is like it's a way of, kind of categorizing information.
Yeah. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
Well, I mean, maybe going back to sort of the evolutionary idea, it could have been something that was sort of invented. I would sort of say to like put, order, but also maybe control around people. That would be my kind of initial like instinct about it. Yeah, like I mean, I sort of think about like kind of containing like empirical knowledge and sort of the I think it was like I'm remembering like my like college philosophy, but I think it was, like Kant, would talk about sort of these like the finite factors of like space and time being necessary conditions for empirical knowledge. But I think it's also evolved into a way of controlling people. That's what I would say.
Yes. Do thoughts create emotions?
I think, I guess in my work, like I work with a lot of like neuroscientists. I'm kind of like a hobbyist in this area. Obviously, I'm more of like definitely not from a scientific background, but I think in that vein, like a neuroscientist would say that emotions like don't exist, right? That thought is like the driving factor, that there's no like biological marker for an emotion, and that it's sort of a learned thing or a practice thing, or even something that's developed through like a culture.
Wow, I didn't know this. This is heavy. So they're more neuroscientists are more mind and brain oriented.
Definitely, but I think, but they, I think there's a whole field of neuroscience that looks at all of these things, so it was like literally mapping the brain. And from what I remember, and don't quote me because I'm definitely not from that field, but I think, the idea is that the emotions, there's not like a distinct place, like in the brain for emotions, but the brain builds emotions. It's a way of regulating the body. And then that wiring is created through experience.
It's amazing because just last week I was wondering, I mean, it must be theorized over the years. Why did the heart become the symbol of love? It's a body organ. And then there's like, oh, that's love, the heart. And there must be some story, but I was like, where'd that come from?
Yeah. I mean, it could be the brain, right? And this is like one view of it, I guess, sort of like, yeah.
Well, I like that you said instinctual. That's really what I'm after in these conversations and dialogues is your impulse, your instinct. Some people, I ask question, they go, oh, that's a neuroscientist question. I don't know that. And I go, well, just your guess, your impulse is what really I'm after. So this one, I don't know what I think until I fill in the blank.
Until a good amount of time has passed since an experience has happened. That's what I'd
Yeah.
say.
Can humans think without language?
I guess it depends what language is, right? You know, so like if you think of I mean, I would say like language broadened from sort of like what we're doing right now, you know, if language is like symbols or, you know, imagery, or you know, if you kind of broaden it out, I would say then yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Chomsky says a language is not just words, it's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Talk to the Italians, you know, and sort of no, I don't know. I mean, I think like let me think. Yeah, I mean, that definitely I would agree with Chomsky. I think that that's a lovely way of, you know, and he would know best, right? But that's a lovely way of thinking of language. Um I would say also though it's what am I thinking about? You know, like that question makes me kind of think a little bit about that movie, the Darjeeling, was it the Darjeeling Limited or
Yeah.
Unlimited? It's you know, there's like that scene sort of towards the end of the film with Angelica Houston where they just, you know, they agree like not to talk about things, but they're just gonna express, you know, their feelings through their gaze, you know, and I thought that that was such a beautifully done scene. And it makes me kind of think about, you know, just the ways that we express one another, you know, ourselves to one another beyond language, which I think can be quite limiting for a lot of people.
Wow, that's good. I've been studying this whole thing about the human gaze, eye contact, the female gaze, the biological. There's so many thoughts about this thing about the gaze, but one of my favorite lines ever is Michael Ventura said, "The best thing you can do with a homeless person is look them in the eyes."
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is a heavy statement because people do not, they want to, oh, I'll give you $1, but they don't want to look them in the eyes. And I mean, that to me is an amazing just thought, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely, and it's like kind of such a vulnerable thing. I mean, on the flip side of it, you know, so I lived in New York City for 20 years before I moved here to Dublin, and just recently, you know, moved here, and I would say like in times of, you know, when you're feeling sort of vulnerable or times of like fear or, you know, late at night or on the subway or whatnot, like the worst thing you would want to do is make eye contact with somebody,
Yeah.
you know? So it's
Oh, yeah.
interesting.
It's tough. Yeah, I know this is a stupid question. I know it's both, and it depends, but your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I don't think that's a stupid question, but I think it's completely dependent on the person. I would say
Yeah.
that you know, it it really I would say that just varies from person to person. You know, I tend to feel that I have to think about what I feel. So
Yeah.
that would be like me, but, you know,
Yeah.
certainly a lot of other folks you know, I've had these conversations with different people in my life and, some people you know, I've heard some people say things like, "Oh, I don't really know what happened on that occasion, but I knew how I felt." Like, so when they're recalling like a memory, they can't remember what happened, but they remember like the feeling that they had.
Yep. No, it's because you can't really separate feeling from thinking, but we think we can because we invented the words. So we go, oh, we can, but they're probably so interlocked. These are two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
So the soul is a tricky one for me. I'm not really sure. I never really know what to think about soul, you know, like what the soul is. And so I'm not sure. Maybe I'll pass on that one.
Fine. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
I mean, again, I'm going to think of a movie, but I would say like I'm really thinking of 2001: The Space Odyssey, you know, and so maybe there's within that isn't Hal meant to be like the kind of most charismatic like character in that film, right? I mean, I would say no, but I would say it's an interesting thing to think about, and I think people are kind of obsessed with this right now. You know, the idea of like the robots taking over. Although it seems like that's been kind of a thing that's gone back to maybe the space age, I suppose. Yeah.
It's been around many years. Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Meaning.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it, or are we more so creating it?
Well, going back to my neuroscientist friends, I would say we are creating it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I tend to agree. I tend to agree with them. They're smarter than me, but you know, I would say, yeah, like I think that we're creating it.
yeah. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Mm, maybe I'll say thought.
That's right. You know, there's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right.
God, phew.
No, it's funny because there are so many people say speed of light, but you
Oh,
know, it is interesting because it goes into more of a metaphorical world. Some of these questions are literal. You can take them literally, or you can take them metaphorically, or you can find a you know, space in between. Like so I
yeah,
appreciate that.
yeah.
There's a poet, Audre Lorde. She said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer, a colleague, responded to her and said, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest?
Hmm. It's hard to come up with new tools, you know, I think that they're both interesting thoughts, you know, I mean, so my work has largely been focused on kind of social justice work throughout my career, and you know, I probably when I started out, I would have had the belief that, you know, small actions are the thing that will or small changes are the thing that are gonna, like, lead to a bigger change, to sort of like a collective, like, larger change. Now in our current time, and maybe since I've gotten older, it seems like things are getting worse, you know, and that I would agree more with like Audre Lorde's, you know, idea of like the dismantling is sort of more imperative at this moment, and yet it can feel overwhelming, right? Because there have been so many efforts to try and make change in a variety of different ways. There's definitely a lot of people like thinking about these things. You know, I've been doing a lot of work on the fragility of democracy lately with one of the organizations that I work with, and so there's a lot of thinkers that I've been spending time with that, you know, talking about democracy and sort of the idea of like democracy being a verb and something that is not like an inherent right, but something that, you know, requires struggle to maintain, you know. And so in that regard, I'm not sure that I have like a particular tool, but I think that there are certain things like, you know, tried and true things like our voting rights that really
Yeah,
need to be upheld, you know, ways of engaging people with civic engagement, making it accessible, you know, not just voting, but you know, local government work. And I'm, you know, this is would sort of be my focus would be, you know, thinking about how do you make like getting involved at a local level within your local community available to a wider group of the populace, so it's not just like a limited thing for like a select few or for people who, you know, have 9 to 5 jobs maybe and then can afford to like, you know, participate in government, you know. How do you make like democracy sort of like a broader, really that broader tent, because I think it's so imperfect, but it's really it's like the best system that we have still, you know. So Yeah, that would be my
That's good.
response.
And we're going to get into all that. That was good. What new toy do you suggest?
Toy, I don't know. Um, toy, I don't have a toy. No, I mean, you mean, is this like a technology or it could be any kind of,
Yeah, again, it's you can put in the context you want. It was just funny because for years I've asked what new tool do you suggest, and someone says, "Well, I have a toy." So I started asking toy just sort of to keep it playful and whatnot. So
yeah.
no worries. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
The immediate next thing, like probably the morning, I worry
Yeah.
about. I'm a worrier, so I have a lot of worries.
Marshall McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound, the poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might be able to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Cynthia, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Oh, distraction, I'd say, Jerry. I think that, we're all just kind of being inundated more
Yeah,
and more, with information and distraction. And I think it befuddles people and can, creates a lot of distraction. I think about Donald Trump and like his years as president, and that was his, my opinion, like his major strategy was like, let's, say some crazy thing to distract from like this bigger policy piece that's going on. So the poor artists amongst us, it's like, I think are doing, their best to kind of draw attention to, sort of what's going on in the world and their interpretations of it. But in some ways it's a little bit of like a drop in, what people are seeing. And you
yeah,
see that in like social media too, just even with the algorithms of like what bubbles up and what resonates and news stories and all of it, like what things are attracting people's attention.
yeah. Do artists have moral obligation?
No more than anybody else.
Yeah. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Old ideas. Sorry, I had to think about that for a second, but old ideas probably. Yeah.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
I'm not sure if I can or not, or if it would be like a suggested memory,
Yeah,
yeah, like I feel that, when you're a kid and growing up, you have stories that are told to you and that becomes kind of an implanted memory in a way. And so I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I have what I think is like a memory of like my first house, but I'm not sure if it is or if it was just my parents used to tell a lot of stories about living there and that house in particular. And
yeah,
they would tell these, I mean, this story in particular was like, we lived in an area where there was like a levee, and when there was like a rainstorm, my mother would tell the story of like, oh, all the parents would go outside to slow down the traffic because when cars would come down the street, it would slosh water up over like the
yeah.
doorstep. And so in my head, I can like visualize that, but I'm like, I don't think that's really my memory. I think it's
Right.
just a story.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
I think it depends on the person. Obviously trauma exists for a lot of us. And, so for many people, it can be, quite a curse and quite a traumatic thing to get through.
Yeah. Cynthia, tell me someone within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model. And what specifically was that impact?
Um, well, obviously parents are such a big, influence. I would have been, I guess like my, my life in some ways, my early life and just my life in general was, what do you want to say, molded a little bit by the fact I had older parents. So my parents were born in the 1930s and would have come of age during sort of like the New Deal FDR era. And so I feel like I was really influenced by that and their sort of like ethos around, like a sort of social compact and, the idea of like we're part of a society and other people are, more important in a way than ourselves. So I would say, yeah, both my mom and dad.
That's a
And
beautiful thing. That other people are more important than the self. That is an amazing thing. And then outside your immediate family, anyone?
yeah, well, I'm thinking this week, actually, Jerry, yesterday I had like a long Zoom memorial service for an aunt who passed away last week. And so I've been thinking about her a little bit. She was my dad's younger sister, and she died of Parkinson's. And she was like an early diagnosis Parkinson's person. So she was diagnosed when she was 48, and she died, how old was she? She was 74. So she lived for a really long time with that. And I would say, she was a big inspiration in the sense of, just like one of these people who's like a kind of a sunny personality and real strength over adversity, and just
Yeah,
really kind of kept going, like, and became, such a like a role model for other people dealing with that condition.
beautiful. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
They didn't. No,
Do you pray?
no,
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
God doesn't exist.
Thank you. You really did it. I'm glad you laughed. And also, it's really me and you versus the wording on the question. So
Yeah.
you didn't hold back. You said, God, that was good. But do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Well, evil is another kind of tricky word for me, like soul and God. So, I mean, I would say, like, definitely, I don't really believe in like evil people. I think that people are the result of like their circumstances and the way that they grew up and things that have happened to them and mental health conditions and any number of factors. Yeah.
Well, the real hidden question is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you react to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Um, well, I think all the people you mentioned are men, and so I would say that men.
That is so true. I'm glad you observed that. I mean, I didn't do that intentionally, and I've been looking for some female comments on you. So if you come across any, please let me know.
It just makes me think that are men more apt to think of in terms of like enemies,
Yeah,
whereas women maybe would be, not to be like stereotypical, but is there something where there's like, like I wouldn't think of myself as really having like an enemy.
yeah,
And I guess I would think a little bit about, just like turn the other cheek kind of mentality.
yeah.
If I did, that's always sort of my intention. I don't know. I definitely am not perfect and I don't follow through with that, but I do think that, love your enemy is sort of like, isn't that some sort of adage? I don't know. Maybe that's from the Bible. I'm not
That
sure.
is love enemies, but it is, it reminds me of Ram Dass said, I'm having a real hard time loving George Bush. It's like fill in the blank. You brought up Trump. I'm having a real hard time loving Trump. If you
Yeah.
say that to anyone, they'll go, get away from me. People don't want to hear that. But,
Yeah.
and it is funny. Is he our enemy, or is he just part of this, what you talked about, this earlier social thing that we're all in?
I mean, I think it's like, I think the same thing about Putin. Like, if you got rid of Putin, there would be another like
Yeah.
10, people
Yeah.
maybe worse than him,
Yeah.
that would be lined up. And I think that Trump is a representation of a part of our society.
Yeah.
He's like, it's not like him as the person that we need to be worried about. It's like what he represents, I would
Yeah.
say. So as far as like dealing with him as an enemy, yeah, I don't, like we all like have that feeling of like, oh, I just want to get rid of this person. I don't
Yeah.
want to like have to listen to him anymore, or deal with him. But I don't think that that is gonna like solve the
Yeah.
deeper issue in our society in America.
Yeah. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism." Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Hmm. That's hilarious because the two of them would be like the biggest interpreters of like reality. I mean, I can't think of like any two authors that are more just like, let's just throw it all out there and see what happens. So
I mean, yeah, it's good. See, you're really listening, and I appreciate that, because really it's an ironic thing what I'm saying, and I isolated these comments to make a point,
I know. Yeah.
to make a sort of a viewpoint. So, anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, going back to whatever, like the cave paintings or whatnot, I mean, there's definitely like an inherent, drive towards like storytelling and
Yeah,
interpretive, storytelling. And so I
yeah,
think the medium is like something, that is, changeable like over time. And I think, I mean, obviously, you and I share a love of Joyce. I also, have a fascination slash, bang my head against a wall with Faulkner. But I would say, like, both of them, I have such admiration for the both of them because they were people that were trying to really reinterpret, their mediums of their time. And so, yeah, I mean, but I think yeah, they were probably like, I imagine Joyce was kind of tongue in cheek in saying that, but it's an interesting quote, right? And it's
yeah.
interesting that he did that as a job briefly.
Yeah, it's funny, and how important. I mean, there's actually an amazing movie on YouTube by Marty Scorsese. It's How Did Cubism Affect Cinema, and How Did Cinema Affect Cubism? In
Mm,
45 minutes, it's just astounding how the two overlap, and we don't think of that. We
yeah,
don't think of how did the radio and the movies and electronic word affect Joyce writing Finnegan's Wake. It's like
yeah,
huge, but literature people don't really want to go too deep. They want to say, "Oh no, he's a lit guy. He's Dante Vico. He's a yeah." Go ahead.
yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, obviously, like to talk about Finnegan's Wake for a second, I would say that that is something that there's so much that's fascinating about it. But one of the things for me, in exploring it is sort of like what is narrative and what are our expectations around story and the way that we understand a narrative. And when you remove sort of, these parameters of kind of time and, sort of a plot and plotting, and sort of that idea from it, like what does it become? And yeah, like he was so ahead of his time, right? And in thinking through that and sort of how, nowadays, there's probably so many things that I'm not aware of with regards to the ways that people are telling stories. But yeah, but I think that there's a lot of different influences probably from those, writers that were coming about in like the 20s and 30s, on our times now. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
let's stay on Joyce for a second. Your interest in Joyce, well, actually, we should wait because it'll go backwards. So let's do it this way. What what was the tipping point where you decided to say, "I'm a writer. I want to pursue writing as a career"? as a calling. And then, your sort of other thing, which is like your day job, is ethical storytelling. Or how do you put that into terms of what you are? You're a social change organizer, the
Yeah.
tipping points for those two callings, being a writer of fiction and being a social change organizer.
Yeah. They I guess they kind of went hand in hand in some ways. I mean, I wouldn't have ever thought, and I don't actually make a living off from my creative writing. So that's like what a lot of people do, but I would say that wouldn't have been something I wouldn't have had like a lot of confidence that I could think of myself as being a writer. That wasn't sort of my family background, and sort of where I was coming from. That wouldn't have been kind of coming out of like two depression era parents, it just wouldn't have been like a thing that I had any example of. I had like a few relatives, I would say, who, like, my grandmother wrote poetry. I had like one aunt who lived in Pasadena, California, and she taught community college and then wrote on the side, but it wasn't really like a thought that I had until I got a little bit older. I always wrote, going back to when I was young, I mean, as a child probably, but like as a teenager, and then definitely like through college and in my 20s. And then I went to graduate school for creative writing in my 30s, my early 30s. So it was pretty late that I really began to kind of have a little bit more confidence that anybody would ever want to read anything that I wrote. And so that. But then with regards to sort of like social activism and my sense of like, kind of that sort of came more from my family, I would say, in the sense of like kind of giving back to like my community, and the idea that I was talking about before, that like my life is not as important really as like others, and the idea of service to others, and that just kind of grew. And then I think the two kind of combined. At some stage I became a speechwriter, working for Planned Parenthood about 20 years ago, and then it just kind of grew from there. And I've sort of found my niche, telling stories of social change organizations, and then the people that are impacted by them. And then I continue my writing, and have been writing kind of longer form pieces as well.
Really good. A screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. When you're writing a Cynthia fiction piece, what role does intention play in your creative process?
I hope in the beginning, very little, I would hope, like, in the beginning when I'm writing, I think what I'm looking for is to have that sort of like, step outside of like my conscious like brain a little bit, and just be able, that's sort of like the pleasure of it for me, is being able to kind of get in whatever that like sort of mindset is, where you're not really like so much, thinking about it, and you're just sort of you're doing, and you're kind of conjuring up words, and you're able to get kind of lost in your own, storytelling. And then later, I think the conscious part is like much more in like the editing process, and making it, for like crafting like a structure, or, especially for the longer pieces, and in the editing process, definitely.
And Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing a fiction piece?
Again, hopefully very little. So, I mean, obviously he was much more like successful than I am, so maybe there's something to that. But yeah, no, I mean, not much, in the beginning. I think it's not until, like I say, I'm sending out a story to like a journal or a competition, or like that type of thing, where I'm looking to have something published, then I might have like other people read it, and then I'm a little more conscious of it, of the audience.
Beautiful. McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, like knife and fork extend our teeth. Shutter and a camera It's like an extension of our eyelid. Even like non-tangible, say religion or philosophy, might be an extension of consciousness. What is the writing utensil, whether it's the pen or a keyboard? For you, what does the writing utensil extend? What humanness?
Hmm. I think, gosh, it probably depends in different phases of my life, like what I've been focused on writing, maybe, I think that there is some overlap between that and what I, refer to as my day job, in the sense that, you know, I'm kind of interested in undertold stories, I guess you could say, and so people whose stories are not as like prominent or as seen, and then also something about so it's that, and then maybe at that as it connects to the idea of sort of just the unseen things that happen,
Yeah.
I grew up in like an American, very generic American suburb, and I think I grew up with this idea that there were always sort of, well, there were actually like things happening, like secret things happening that I wasn't privy to, or that, things like affairs that were happening, or, drugs or just whatever, like all kinds of like hijinks and stuff that were happening behind like those, the closed doors of like
Yeah.
an American suburb. And so that's always fascinated me as well.
Yeah, maybe that could lead us into talking about this project you're working on about the Great Muddy Valley.
Yeah.
Because if you want to just talk about that a little, because Carl Andre, the sculptors, said sculpture as place. And it
Mm.
almost sounds like you have some interest in a place and the stories that aren't told about the place. Any sort of um, words about that project and how's it going, or what was the start of it?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Jerry. It's, so that book is written, and kind of as it goes, mid edit, like constant editing, I guess you could say, but it kind of took life. So both my parents passed away right before the pandemic, and then they had retired in their old age to the Muddy Valley, which is also referred to as the Moapa Valley, there in Nevada. It's a really, really remote area that my mom grew up in the 1930s and 40s. And then her whole family lived there. She was one of 10 kids. And so our family used to travel from the East Coast of America to Nevada, nearly every summer to visit our grandparents and relatives there. And then when my parents retired there, I would travel back and forth from New York to there. And then when they both died, I sort of had this realization of, it was this place that I'd kind of taken for granted and hadn't really had too much interest in, when I was going there and when they were all alive. But then I sort of realized it was sort of like a lost place, and that my mom's family was sort of like disappearing, also literally they were, all of her siblings were kind of dying off. And so, yeah, it became like a renewed place of interest for me, and a kind of a rich place of interest. So, yeah, so I found it maybe especially during the pandemic, I wrote that book, and it just became like, a way of sort of talking about both like the experience of, dealing with like parents' terminal health, illnesses and death. And then also just sort of like the idea of like a lost place, that is kind of a disappearing place.
And is that fiction or nonfiction?
It's, so it
Yeah.
started out as a nonfiction, and now it's kind of evolving a little bit as I've been editing it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Because I'm also curious how you chose Dublin to live in, because I'll start it with this question. There's a great movie called Problema. It's 2010. It's free on YouTube. And they basically ask a bunch of really important thinkers, political, social workers, all types, like 20 questions. And one of the questions is amazing to me, but it says, should we have the right to choose where we live? And it's like, I mean, most people are like, of course. Like, I was born in Flint, Michigan, and I lived in Venice, California for 43 years. But when I go back and see my hometown, it's like, you shouldn't have left. You abandoned your roots, in a way. In the other way, it's like, no, you have a right to do whatever you want. But it is this phenomenon, like you're 20 years in New York City, now you're in Dublin. How did you choose moving to Dublin? Because now you talked about the Great Muddy Valley a little, and now the way we met was your interest in Joyce, which is so connected deeply to just a little cheesy store in Dublin called Sweeney's. I mean, I don't mean to say cheesy in a bad way. Like, it's amazing. Sell lemon soap, and you can get all the Finnegan's Wake people in the world to gather together and have a great time.
Well, at some stage in another conversation, I'll have to ask you like how you got connected to the Swedes group in particular.
Well, I can tell you just really quick, as
yeah.
I've ran Finnegan's Wake Reading Club in Venice for 28 years. So when COVID shut us down, we started finding Finnegan's Wake reading clubs more accessible because of Zoom.
Oh,
So
okay.
now I go to 4 different Finnegan's Wake reading clubs, and it's amazing. It's so much better and richer. So that's, I just found Sweeney's and I was like, this is better than mine by far,
Really?
Oh yeah, it's way better. But I mean, they all vary. It's fun. And it's basically meeting people. That's what the wake to me is Sarah. So anyways, how did you get to Dublin? Any thoughts on this?
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I mean, the quickest way of saying it is that it's like the home of my heart, I guess you could say. I came here for the first time. I came to Ireland for the first time when I was 19. I was like an au pair in France. And so I was like traveling around Europe and I just loved it. And then I went to graduate school in Scotland. And then during that time, one of my best childhood friends had moved to Ireland and I spent a lot of time visiting. And it's just over the years, I've spent a lot of time here. And then I think like a lot of people, during the pandemic, just was reevaluating, did I want to spend the rest of my life in New York City and or what I wanted to do. And because I work for myself, basically, I had that freedom to be able to kind of pick up and move. But to like your earlier point, yeah, I think it's a super privilege, I mean, I would say that for sure. I think it's a privilege to be able to live, to live where you want. I also think increasingly it's I mean, maybe it's becoming more of the way of the world, but I think it's largely like an American phenomenon to just pick up and say, I'm going to choose to live in like a particular place because I like it. I don't know if it has to do with sort of like the history of immigration in the United States. A lot of that is like forced migration, economic migration, people fleeing from, horrible hardships. But I do think it created like a little bit of a sub atmosphere in America of people kind of moving around quite a bit and moving far from their families and just, living kind of a little more disparate lives, that I find is less common in a lot of cultures and a lot of countries, including here in Ireland. People find it very strange that like my own immediate family, they live like in all different places around the United States. And that seems like less common here. Maybe it's becoming more common, but I mean, yeah.
Really good. And now the history of Joyce in your life. You're growing up. Who were you first reading that had the biggest impact on you? What authors, or were there any that you really gravitated towards? And then how did you discover Joyce? Was it in college because they told you to, or what got you to Finnegan's Wake? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so with regards to authors, I mean, I think probably in say like in college or whatnot, I would have, really been attracted to a lot of like the old, like the classic novelists, sort of like the big novel, like the Dickens and the sort of, Tolstoy and a lot of like those Russian authors I really liked. And then I think probably then that evolved my taste. If I had to say, like, sort of now, like my favorite kind of like writers would be Southern American writers, sort of like Eudora Welty and, Carson McCullers and Flannery O'Connor and, Ralph Ellison and like sort of all of these like people that wrote about like these slightly, a little bit, I don't know if it's really like gothic, but, a little bit like weird stories and stuff about, the American South, and a lot of those female authors I really, really loved. Joyce, I came to quite late in life, like a lot of things. So I didn't probably, probably I didn't start. I read Ulysses like maybe, 10 years ago. And I got really into it. I thought it was just like such a big, messy book, and I just sort of loved it. I loved kind of the chapter by chapter being like its own adventure and just kind of like a whole unique thing. I thought that like, it was also just interesting, like how he, wrote these, what we refer to as like really straight stories, straightforward, like the Dead and all of the Dahmer stories, were just kind of like these very, straightforward stories, and then how that evolved so quickly. I never would have thought I would read Finnegan's Wake, but I guess when I found myself sort of back here in Dublin, I had a friend who was like, a volunteer there at Sweeney's and had mentioned, that reading group. And so I thought, oh, like if I'm ever going to read it, it would be with like a group of people, because it just seems so difficult. But I'm just astounded by him. I think that there's something also that I love about, sort of like his own, like my sense of his struggles within like his writing, that is my own like impression of him, is that he really suffered like for his work. I think that he was a true artist in that way, and really just kind of gave everything to it. And then just, like he just is funny too, I think that that's like part of it. I like the humor of it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Struggles from within. He gave it his all. Let's just divert for a second. What's the background on your work ethic? Where did you get your work ethic from?
Yeah, my mom, who was like a farm girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my mother would have been like the sweetest, nicest person, would not have had any kind of judgment towards anybody for anything, except if she thought somebody was lazy, and so that like, like translated. And so,
because I love asking this question, because everybody got their work ethic from their parents, basically. I mean, I don't get any variations. Like a lot of my questions, I love the variations. And some of them, almost everybody answers it a certain way. And if you look up work ethic in Wikipedia, about the third paragraph down, it says, this could be a scam by consumer culture. And it's funny. You wonder how driven Joyce was, but it's evident when you said this guy was driven.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah. And really like a true genius. I think this is like, these words are like kind of thrown around quite a bit. A true, like he's an artist, he's a true genius, and it's like in this way, like when you read, like the Dead, for instance, and you get to that final, like, page or two, you would think that story was written by a much older person, I think he was 26 or 27 or something when he wrote that. And you're just like, what, how did he know about like this, like what it would be like to be married to somebody for, 20 years. And then all of a sudden realize, I mean, he was just amazing, but yeah, I mean, definitely like the work ethic thing and capitalism, like probably that does go hand in hand, and sort of like the anxiety of like the immigrant nation. But I think it is interesting being here in Ireland, because it's like a little bit different, there's a little more of like the history is more like one of, colonialism, right? And so like the idea of working, is just not as, it's not, I don't know, it's different, I'd say, Yeah.
And then it's the balance too. Like, how did he know how to appreciate great food and great wine and relax so that he could put all his all into doing it? It's evident But the true genius line was great because I just recently got this line. Frank Zappa said that genius is when you steal from people and they can't tell who you stole from.
It's
And
probably
this is Harold Bloom's anxiety of influences. You absorb your influence, then you abandon him. So
true.
Joyce said, I'm applied Aquinas. He absorbed Aquinas. He absorbed Vico, Dante, and then he abandoned them. It's like, well, no, we study it and we can go, oh, this is where he got this from, and we trace it back, but it's almost in this disguise. So I'm curious your experience with the wake so far, and you get it because it's funny. It's fun to share this time by changing the reading experience. You said it earlier. You reinterpret the medium, and it's no longer just an eye experience, it's an ear experience because you're seeing these words and you're hearing how everybody else in the room mispronunciates them. They're like, oh, I wouldn't have pronounced it that way. Or, they like, I'm such a bad reader. When I get to a word, I just go, I just mumble.
Yeah.
And some of these people are such good readers. Every syllable is like correctly? Well, not necessarily. So again, it's a stupid question. How much do you think you get the wake, and how much do you think Joyce got the wake, from 0 to 100%?
I think I'll start with him. I mean, I think he knew what he was doing. I think he knew what he was doing, and I think I'm sure we've talked about this in the group, but I think it was like all of his stories are sort of evolutions of the next, so it's I don't know that much about like visual art, but I would say like, is it like kind of almost like a cubist kind of like,
Yeah.
version of like one of his like earlier stories, or there are times, when I'm like, the other week actually, like when we were sitting there reading it, I was thinking there was some line that popped up where I was like, this sounds like an advertisement, and it reminded me of like a Bloom written advertisement, and I was like, oh, well, maybe it probably is. It's probably like all just kind of being, I don't want to say like recycled, but a little bit like in his brain, of like all of his influences and everything he ever thought. It's like, here it is, and I think it's just, but I think he had like, I don't know. I think he had a clear plan of what he was doing. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Oh, well, it varies. I mean, I love when people say 80%, like Joyce got it 80%. Anything other than 100%, I love to hear. But yeah, it's you kind of feel that he knew what he was doing, but he probably is, like you said this earlier, and I love Martha Graham saying, great artists aren't ahead of their times, they are their times. So Joyce is listening to shortwave radio in Paris in the 20s and writing it all down. So
Yeah.
did he know? I don't know. He doesn't know 65 languages. There's no way he knows 65 languages. But if he heard some Swahili and wrote it into the book, then does he go, okay, I know what that word means and I want to fake people out and say this, or,
Yes. And
with them?
yeah, and how much does a lot of the stuff that we think about him just become kind of like a legend? I mean, we'll never know, right? And it's fun to speculate, but I wonder if just, even like Friday night I went to see at the Abbey Theater here a version of Ghosts, Ibsen's play,
Yeah.
and so I know that Joyce was like influenced by Ibsen, right? And so some folks were saying like, oh, like the story The Dead was like very directly like influenced by that play. But do we know that for sure? Do we know that he actually spoke like Norwegian? Like, was he really like?
Oh, he was an Ibsen. Joyce was a known Ibsen wannabe. Totally.
Yeah, yeah.
So he probably, but the beauty is how much do you feel he abandoned? Or how much did he abandon? That's a real challenge, to absorb an influence and then abandon. It's the difference between retro and rooted,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say there's a good amount of abandonment, and especially
Yeah,
maybe at that time, Jerry, wouldn't you think?
yeah,
Like, because
yeah.
he's, it's not like he's got Wikipedia or something, he's not like he doesn't have the internet, he's not like calling people up to or emailing them or texting or whatever. It'd be like, oh yeah, what was that thing?
Right.
Yeah, that would be my thought, but you
Well,
know,
it goes along with this. Two of my film heroes, their mantras, George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression.
hmm,
And Cecil Taylor, jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me.
hmm,
So is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever culture, technologies, and environments are dominant?
I would lean towards the latter, in the best of times, I mean, I would lean towards the latter, but I think, with the idea, like, I guess when you think about like actors, right? And there's like certain actors that are able to really just absorb, into like their roles and disappear into their roles, right? Versus
Yeah.
like the actors that are sort of like always themselves, but just kind of, in a different role. And so yeah, like I think I gravitate towards the latter, this
Yeah.
idea of like that it's coming, kind of through you,
Yeah.
and you're the vehicle for
Yeah.
it, but it's not, but there's a little bit of mystery to it, I think is what I like.
Great, great word. That's one of my favorite words. Auden's sort of attitude was the mystery of art is we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. We
Mm,
want to think, oh, it activates you, but it could be pacifying you. But
yeah,
so it's not, there's nothing bad with going to a feel good movie and just relaxing and zoning out or trancing out.
yeah,
But you want, something to go get you stimulated to go, do something too. So,
yeah,
you know,
definitely.
when
It's
we're
like,
reading Awake, I was like, this is a big jerk off session. We're just sitting here like this is, and I love it because all these people think, well, I'm a serious literature person, and they're like, you're reading like it's like porn, or it's like, it's like the worst like jackass movie, or it's like Beavis and Butthead. It's like really getting away with murder, but because it's Joyce, we think, oh, this is highbrow. But that's the beauty of it. You cannot, Anyway, sorry I went on.
no, not at all, not at all. And there is like a reverie to it, right? Like in a way of just being kind of like lulled into like the words and the language, and so it's not necessarily like, I don't want to say like it isn't like a high intellectual pursuit, but it's kind of not, like it is, but it's not.
That's totally it. It's both.
Yeah,
How do you do both? Because
yeah,
as soon as you say it's more one or the other,
yeah,
was Joyce a genius or a scam artist?
yeah.
We had a guy, this was in 28 years, we've had a lot of people come to our wake meeting in Venice. And we had this guy show up, and he was a typical Irish old guy with the red nose, like total drunkard red nose. And he sat there and heard us read it, and he goes, do you guys believe this shit? Like
Yeah.
my other question I love to ask people is Finnegan's Wake real? And I'm like, there's nothing more real than Finnegan's Wake, but in a way, it's all made up. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And maybe it's like two other things I'll say about it is like the dreamscape, like motif or whatever, and just like that is like the whole gist of it is like fascinating, right? So it's like kind of feeds into what you're saying, in my opinion, and of like, you know, like what he's playing with, like he's fucking with us basically. He's like, is this real? Is it
totally.
not? Like what's happening here? I thought I was thinking of something else and now I've lost it. But anyway, I'm sure it'll come
Well,
back.
it will come back because the dreamscape, you have ESP, because that was the next question. You know, Beckett said it's not a description of a dream, it is a dream. You know, it's not, it's like if you take any psychedelics, you can get the same high when you're reading Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people. There's some moments where it's just like, what? It just like liberates your spirit into this. And it's actually McLuhan got everything he knew from Finnegan's Wake, basically. And he said, artists dream awake. And then, not to sound elitist, but everyone has this ability to create these scenarios at night when they're sleeping, dreaming.
Mhm.
But artists can also do this, or also do this while they're awake. They dream
Mhm.
awake. So my question was, have dreams played a role in your creative process as a fiction writer?
I don't, not that I'm aware of, obviously the subconscious is lurking there, so there might be something happening, but not, I mean, not that I'm aware of, and not in the way that I know a lot of other writers would be, very tuned into the sort of like dream life and dream world. I mean, I think with Joyce, it's also like the dream is also like the dream of trauma, and he was
Yeah.
like so influenced probably by Freud at that time,
Yeah.
Um, there's this other writer, when I like, we were talking about Faulkner before, and then like Eudora Welty, sort of they like, I think the three of them, Joyce included, all have kind of sort of a commonality of like they were very place based also, and even though Joyce, left Dublin, it was like everything was there, everything was written about Dublin. And then Eudora Welty, I think like one of the things I found really moving about her was this idea that she just lived her entire life in this little town in Mississippi in her parents' home, sitting in the front room. And just from that front room, it was like whole casts of characters and
Yeah.
imagination and just everything you could imagine, sort of came out of her. And Faulkner, created a world as well, and so it's kind of interesting. It's like they weren't, it was like the opposite of like a Hemingway or something, of like, the person who's like going out and having like adventures to write about, it's literally like going within themselves, to like, unearth like what's coming out on the page.
Yeah, it's sort of like Joyce's mantra, an epiphany in everydayness. You can just walk down the street in Dublin and you have an epiphany. You don't have to, fly to America. And
Exactly.
you know but I'm glad you brought up Freud, because I left that out by mistake. Can art making be egoless?
Mm, I don't think so. I think there's always some sort of ego in there, kind of going back to like my original like hesitation of like even referring to myself as a writer, it would be, I think there's like an ego involved there once you do kind of like make that, like to say you're an artist, or, to really declare that, I think is like, it kind of goes hand in hand somewhat of like you have an authority.
Yeah. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Depends on what setting, I suppose, I guess it depends on what setting. In my day-to-day life, I probably do a lot more compromising, but I would say like it kind of chips away at my like self a little bit, when it kind of goes against my sense of conviction.
Yeah. T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
I don't know.
That's like, wait, I got to tell you, that's my favorite answer. This great experimental filmmaker in New York City, Abigail Childs, she goes, I wish I knew. She goes, I don't know, but I wish I knew.
Yeah. That's
Like,
a good.
once you find, it's like identity with Alan Watts. Once you find out who you are, you're fucked. So once you find out what language it in, then you're is perception reality?
Um, yes, I would say yes on that one. Yeah.
Why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life may be pointless?
Oh, because it would be so bleak, right? I mean, yeah, it's just like, life can be hard, right? I mean, like, I
Yeah.
think everyone, we are all fond of saying like life, like everyone has like their hardships in life, but for some people it's much harder than for others, to be fair, and so I think, in particular for people when they're going through a difficult time, there's like an essentialness to finding some meaning in sort of what's happening and what in whatever way, I mean, I kind of said earlier, like I don't have any kind of religious beliefs, but I somewhat envy people who do, because I think that that can be like a real comfort for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like one of my favorite jokes by Paul Krasner is the boys up at batting at baseball, and he goes, "Please God, let me hit a home run." And the pitcher goes, "Please God, let me strike him out." And the clouds part, and God's voice comes through the clouds and goes, "You superstitious fools." So there's a activist folk singer, Utah Phillips, says anarchy is making rules for yourself and not others. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Mm, I mean, that's a big topic, but no one, I would say, other than like the people broadly, Yeah, I don't think anyone other than like the collective. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm curious of your pursuit of social injustice and social justice. I mean, this is big in our world today, I think, and it has been most of my life.
Yeah.
And you brought this up earlier, what's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
You know, those are such, I think, interconnected or like reciprocal, I guess, like ideas, right? And so I don't know that there's as much of a difference as that they're meant to go hand in hand. I'd say, like, as far as like, I mean, in a system of governance. So I guess if we're talking about like sort of a society or a system of governance, then I would say like rights and responsibilities are both and, right, like like you could take like voting for instance, and I would say that that's both a right and a responsibility, and so maybe it has to that those two ideas have a little bit to do with sort of what's given but what's expected as well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think I was talking about democracy earlier because this has like been a topic of focus for me for the last 6 months or so. And I, like literally like reading about like different ideas about democracy. And it seems like just the commonest thread is that it is like um it's like an active thing. It's not just like a given, and I think we're seeing that so much now around the world.
Yeah, direct democracy. We live in a plutocracy, but we should pursue direct democracy. But I have to tell you another joke about voting. There's a bumper sticker. It says, if God wanted us to vote, he would have created candidates. Yeah, that's like sad. Um, the other question, this difference question, is what's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Um, like one is more organized, maybe. It's not just, I don't know, maybe one is more organized. I would say like I think no, I mean if I'm gonna think about it like a little more seriously, like I would say that there's, like a rebellion is more an act of desperation, I would say,
Yeah,
and kind of like is like a thing that happens when people are pushed, beyond their limits and their, what they're able to accept. And then revolution would be kind of like maybe a more organized version of that. That would be my closest definition, I'd say.
yeah. And then this socialist said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. That was John Basil Barnhill. But in 2005, V for Vendetta, the movie, paraphrased it and said, people should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. How do
Hmm.
you personally handle false fears? Like the war on drugs. You can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight, and you can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. But we create these false fears like the war on drug or the war on terrorism or the war on poverty. How do you handle these personally?
um, well, I'll just I'll answer my own question. I think because that was like that's I'm a little bit thinking through what those different ideas that you're just sharing. But I wonder. I've thought about this a bit since being in Ireland, and I've just been here, sort of full time since October, and just thinking about how the Garda here, the police, do not have guns, right? And
Yeah.
so it's just kind of a completely different for an American coming here. It's a completely different mindset, and even yeah, like can I just share like a little anecdote, I suppose?
Please. That's what this is all about. Please.
Right. So my first day moving into like this apartment that I'm living in now, it's not my first day, but maybe like the second day that I was here, I was woken up kind of early in the morning by like the buzzer, the apartment buzzer going off. And so I kind of like stumbled up and answered the buzzer. And it was the guards, the police at the door, and they were saying like, "Oh, we're trying to gain access to the building. We need to gain access to the building. So can you buzz us in?" Basically, and coming from New York, I was a little bit like, like a little like just I don't trust that it's the guards,
Yeah.
But then also I just kind of said to them, I was just like, I don't think so. I think I said something like, I don't know, I don't think I can do that. And they were like, oh, okay, like it's fine.
They were like, okay, fine.
And I don't know, I've told this story to a couple of Irish friends and they were like, yeah, like it's just kind of, it's such a different it's a different mindset, right? And it's
Yeah,
not that there isn't crime here, but it's
yeah,
just, I think America is in a category in and of itself. And
yeah.
it's, I don't know, it's such a violent country. It's hard to know sort of like what's going to happen with all of that. But I do think that there is this element of like your suggestion or like the war on drugs and this sort of like the creation of fear, I think is also part of like what maintains that sort of status quo in America around people kind of living in fear, like the guns and the guns, that's like the big thing in my opinion. And then the crime rates there, and then everyone just feeling like afraid of one another, all the time.
Well, fill in the blank. Anger can be a productive emotion when.
Maybe when it's directed in the right way to systems of authority, break down systems of authority.
Yeah. Tell me one major element of your creativeness in your fiction writing, in your pursuit for social justice that stayed the same, in one major element that's changed in the years you've been doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so I'm going to say like two different things, but this is just what comes to mind is that with regards to my writing and creative writing, I would say like it's gotten smaller and more focused. I think like
Yeah.
when I started out, it was sort of I wanted to write kind of like about bigger themes and stories, and then it's gotten smaller. With regards to like my work around social justice, I feel like, again, I don't know if it's just kind of going to the issue of age and getting older or feeling like the world is actually getting more crazy, but I feel like there needs to be like bigger, bolder solutions to all of the problems, the major problems that we're dealing with. And it's just on a personal note too. It's been really sad to see sort of the backtracking of a lot of our inherent rights that I would have grown up with in America, because I never really would have thought the reversal of Roe v. Wade, the Voting Rights Act, all of these things were such landmark things that I would have grown up under. I'm sure like for you and your generation, it's like, what the fuck, it's just crazy, so
How,
yeah.
how did this happen? It's like, what? It
Yeah.
gets unbelievable.
Yeah, all the stuff you fought for. It's like, it's
Yeah.
just insane. Yeah, yeah.
Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength. rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Um, I would say like one thing that I kind of talk pretty openly about in my later years in recent years, would be like just acknowledging like my own insecurities about
Yeah.
things, and I think owning like your own insecurities and being comfortable with them, rather than trying to hide them or pretend that they don't exist. So I would
Yeah.
say that that might be in that category.
Yeah, that's a major McLuhan thing, is how do you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough,
Mm,
or a rejection into a redirection, you know?
mm. Yeah, yeah. How did you get into McLuhan?
Well, I was going to college in Ann Arbor at University of Michigan studying like art history. And
Oh,
I went back and found in one of my notebooks that we were reading his first book, Mechanical Bride. But
oh,
it was many years later, and a friend turned me on to Finnegan's Wake and McLuhan, and it was just like they go hand in hand. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's been fun because he is he is like Joyce. He's really misunderstood.
Okay, yeah. I've never read any of his
Yeah.
his work, but you're making
Well,
me
it's
you're
it's the best example is in the movie Annie Hall by Woody Allen.
he's
It's like he makes a couple minute appearance as McLuhan. And he
yeah,
plays himself. But Woody changes McLuhan, the essence of McLuhan. McLuhan's line was, "Do you mean my whole fallacy is wrong?" That's a question. Woody had him say it as a statement. You mean my whole fallacy's wrong. So he's
mhm,
more McLuhan's more about creating new questions and new metaphors than telling
mhm,
you concepts.
mhm. That's
And
interesting.
so, yeah, he basically teased people to believe his concepts were percepts.
Ah,
So it's there's a difference. So in essence, that no problem with Woody doing that because he turned people on to McLuhan in
yeah.
a pop culture way, and it really evokes another McLuhanism. A half a truth is still a lot of a truth.
Yeah. Did McLuhan
So,
have a problem with it? Sorry to, like, turn this around on you, but did McLuhan have a problem with that? Like, the Annie Hall, did he ever
oh
say
no,
anything? No,
no.
no.
I mean, he could have talked about it a little. I mean, uh, you brought up 2001. Kubrick said, "Why'd you make 2001?" He said, "To convolute McLuhan." He literally said that. He invited him to a pre-release screening, and Marshall fell asleep after 10 minutes. He probably woke up for the Hal part, but it doesn't matter. I mean, these are just like, again, anecdotal things. And in the big picture, it's fun studying McLuhan, especially if you're into Finnegan's Wake. I mean, basically, Marshall said, the if you want to get me, understand me, you have to know all of Joyce and all about symbolist poetry.
Hmm.
Those two
Yeah,
things, you
yeah,
know, and McLuhanites don't do that.
yeah,
They don't really do Finnegan's Wake. There's some, but they sort of that's gobbledygook, you know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, interesting, yeah, yeah.
What is the most significant difference between men and women, physical aside?
Um, the ability to wield power, right? Like, women are kind of disempowered around the world pretty much.
What caused matriarchy?
What caused
Matriarchy,
what
yeah.
caused matriarchy? Wait, is there matriarchy?
See, you win because this is about inventing new questions. This is the Irish. They go, you Irish people answer questions with questions, and they go, we do, eh? But it is if there were cultures that were matriarchy, what would cause it?
Mm. Child rearing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
That's
power of the
yeah.
womb. Yeah. So,
There's a line that goes, "You create what you resist." Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into "You are what you hate." In fact, James Joyce said, "It's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve."
ah,
And Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, "Thank God I'm an atheist." So this idea, any reactions or comments, you create what you resist. I'm not saying you, Cynthia, create what you say. One creates what one resists. Any thoughts on that line?
I mean, my immediate thought kind of just goes to like the dynamic between like the political parties in the US right now, and sort of the whether it's actual backlash or just not perceived, but like created. I feel like there's a lot of created backlash or like false problems that are created by the Republicans, but then like the Democrats are kind of just feeding into it a little bit. So I
Yeah.
mean, that's my initial thought is like
Yeah.
there's sort of things that are actually happening, things that aren't really happening, and then things that are sort of made up,
Yeah.
that are used. So yeah.
It sounds like this storytelling or myth making kind of tendency of humans. And
Yeah.
it's like create the disease and offer the cure.
Yeah.
And Hollis Frampton said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. Can you forget to die?
Can you say the first part again, Jerry?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's an interesting thought because you brought up storytelling earlier. It's sort of like narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because
Mm,
we're waiting to die.
mm.
So the
Yeah.
question is, can you forget to die?
I don't, well, I'll take the first part of that, the quote. I think
Please.
that with the quote, I would say that that is, kind of not to create a theme around our discussion here, but I think that that is the thing that sets like in mind like some structure to a story, right? Like having a finite ending and sort
Yeah,
of this idea of like this is the arc, this is the structure, and it's going to end at a
yeah,
certain stage. So in that sense, I would say like with regards to storytelling or our own stories of our lives, that death is essential. And yet, certainly in America and probably in a lot of other cultures I'm not familiar with, there's sort of an ignoring of death, or sort of like a pretending that death is not there, or just kind of a general fear of that unknown, I guess, is what comes about. But it is interesting, like anytime you enter, even in America, like enter into like different cultures where they really have serious rituals around death, and you realize like the purpose of those rituals is to kind of give that sort of finality and the structure and sort of the sense of like this is whether it's like this is the religious story that we're telling about like what happens with this person that's going to give comfort to the people that are living, or whatever it might be. I think it was telling you like I just came off from like this Zoom memorial service for my aunt yesterday, and it was a bunch of people I didn't know, like including a lot of the extended family and relatives that I haven't really met before. But there was a lot of religious talk, and I was really kind of surprised by that. But I think it's like these are essential elements to death, right? In our understanding of life,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
It's a hard question because people aren't sure whether they're supposed to put it in the context of being literal or metaphorical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I'm glad you brought up ritual because, like the hero's journey,
Mm,
Nassim Taleb says games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is. And when I told someone that, they said, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control.
mm,
Heroes want freedom.
mm,
And then Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, said, if a criminal gets caught, does he go, oh, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, oh, I did something morally and socially wrong?
mm.
So I mean, it's a lot of prompts and thoughts, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
So what punishment is imposing like control, right? I mean, and so if punish if punishment is imposing like controls like on an individual or on society, right? Then there's a lot of different ways in which that's happening, right? I would say that there are yeah, I'm just so I studied Foucault a lot in college, and then I've found myself like kind of going back to like Foucault quite a bit in my middle years, and I like I'm gonna say I think like Foucault's ideas around this would be that like punishment slash control are it's sort of imposed on all different categories of society, so from like the workplace, factories, schools, hospitals, and it's all ways of kind of controlling people. And so in that regard, I would say like the punishment, you could say like Foucault would probably agree, yeah, the punishment does work because we've created these systems and societies by which we're controlling people, and that is like the punishment. I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense, but it's just a
Yeah,
thought.
it is hard to, to deal with the prison industrial complex in America because it's
Yeah.
like huge. And so is reform the goal, or is this punishment? I mean, I know a kid, Venice Boardwalk, I spent half his life or more than 3/4 of his life in jail. And I says, is it HBO, drugs of your choice, and cell phones? He goes, yeah, a lot of it is,
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it's a for-profit industry. We've made it like it's like it yeah, it is like, what is it? It's the new Jim Crow, right? Like it is like kind of like it is
Jim
a
Crow,
system.
yeah.
Yeah, but I'm kind of curious, like moving beyond like the prison too, and what ways are like these sort of systems like have been created. And like my immediate thought kind of goes to like the Amazon warehouses, or kind of the keeping people in poverty, and sort of like the large numbers of of people that are living in poverty without any sort of like escape from that. There's really like no way of kind of moving out of that. So
Cynthia, I asked for 90 minutes. Can you go a little longer?
sure, yeah, I've probably been talking too much, so yes.
No,
Yeah,
no,
sure.
you haven't. I've got a few more and we're out of here, but it's really
Okay.
been fun. And I thank you so much. How do you find peace of mind?
I don't really, unfortunately. Sorry.
If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Oh, I give myself a hug and say like, don't worry so much.
That is nice. A hug. That's what, when I asked someone, what do you do when language breaks down? They said group hug.
Oh, that's nice.
These are 5 Alan Watts questions, just quickly off the top of your head in a few words. 1, who started it all?
Um, uh, John Lennon.
Are we going to make it?
Undecided.
Where do we put it?
Where do we put it? In our back pocket. This is just like word association now.
Oh,
Sorry.
this is good. I love it. 4, who's cleaning it up?
Ah, the underclass.
5, is it serious?
Yes.
Okay, that was great. Which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
Over.
If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
Calamity.
They want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell?
Oh my gosh. None. No, I wouldn't like that. Yeah.
Tell me something good you never had and you never want?
Um, an overt sense of discipline.
Oh, that is great. I've never had that answer.
Sorry.
What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Like one really specific thing, and maybe to end on a hopeful note, is the young women in Iran. I think that
Yeah,
they're amazing. Yeah.
yeah, that's good. And Anthony Burgess, who was complete Finnegan's Wake freak, said, "We must now ask some very different questions about the relationship between music and life." So, what question remains unresolved for you in both your pursuits of fiction and your social justice? And how has those pursuits shaped your behavior?
So, like an unresolved question, it's a funny one, Jerry, because I feel like maybe this is a clear evolution for a lot of people, but I think I started out like both my work and writing with like a lot of what I thought was like a lot of answers. And so I've kind
Yeah,
of just become like more questioning of everything now. And so there would probably be a lot of them that I couldn't
yeah.
really define. Yeah. But yeah, that would be my answer to the first part. What was the second part?
And then how has your pursuit shaped your behavior in the years you've been doing this?
Oh yeah, it's probably made me like a little more empathetic towards others, which I think that's the word that I started with.
That's the word you started with. You know how to go full circle. So, two more and we're out of here. Actually, another Wakean, Thornton Wilder, in 1928 said, "Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time."
Hmm.
You've laid your cards on the table for over 90 minutes. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this. What's it really all about for you?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a lovely, lovely quote. And I would just say, yeah, like vulnerability and kind of like allowing yourself to be more vulnerable, and open and connected with other humans.
Yeah, that is really beautiful. It's a word I'm always trying to figure out. Vulnerable to other humans. That is great. What gives you the most optimism?
Um, mm, I don't know. People like yourself, maybe, people who are sort of thinking carefully and thoughtfully about the world and thinking deeply about other people.
So perfect. I love it. Thank you so much because the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being? And you said empathy. Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being.
Oh.
And that's what empathy is. You got to have another human being, right? Oh, I guess you got to be empathetic towards yourself and others. And the last question is what gives you the most optimism? This is a question they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life, and he says, other people.
Oh.
So
I got
yeah,
it right. Yes.
you're doing good. And I love um, how fun this conversation was for me. I really learned a lot, Cynthia, and I thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you at our next Finnegan's Wake reading.
Yes, it's always fun. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button now, I hope our conversation can keep going on forever and ever.
Thank you. Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks a lot.
Thank